Just want to go through a little bit of what I'm up to right now. I'm making some of these. This is a porch project I've been working on since the fall, and this is going to be the balusters or spindles for the porch area. That's actually, see, it's cut on top, it's going to go on the stairs. But I don't do many things where I have to make repetitive copies of a lot of things. So we have to make about 15 of these. I just want to go through a setup and how you might go about doing something like this when you have to make several of something. My toolbox is not unlimited in what I have to cut metal with. I have a lot of choices, but for this project, the best thing I have is this 4x6 jet horizontal vertical bandsaw. This is a great machine to make horizontal cuts, to slice big pieces of steel into smaller pieces of steel. And for a lot of years, that's all I ever really did with it. This project has required me to do some miter cuts and actually to use the saw as a vertical bandsaw. I'll get to that later. While that's cutting, let's look at the porch project itself. Kind of a cold, snowy day, but the porch that we ended up designing here to replace an old treated lumber porch I'd built about 25 years ago. I used this precast concrete slabs. We had this made just for the project, and also some precast concrete steps, and then fabricated a steel frame with fairly extensive footer under that, had to be poured first of all, and then ended up with this railing. I used railings on both sides, particularly as people age. Sometimes it gets difficult to just climb with one hand, or they may have a dominant hand, or if somebody has a stroke and has some weakness in one hand, it's important to have two railings. So that's what we've got here, but you'll see that there's no balusters or spindles anywhere, and that's the part I'm working on right now. So let's come on back inside where it's a little warmer. When I get ready to install those balusters or spindles, I'm going to have to grind some of that paint off. I just got that on there to keep it from rusting this winter. So these pieces are really, if you think about it, are just three pieces. All I've taken, obviously, would have been a lot easier just use a solid piece of steel for those spindles. But I wanted this decorative element of this triangle. So that's what I just cut, is that triangle. And if we look over here, I've got several already cut and ready to go. And we'll get into the cutting process on that a little bit. But I guess the next thing to do is maybe show you how I set up with the to use this saw vertically. Let's just get this piece of 2-inch out of my way. That's 2-inch 1/8 wall, kind of scrapped from some of the structural stuff I had going. This saw, I added this piece here, which is an extra heavy attachment point for a vertical table. I've got a lot of stuff hanging off this one right now. Normally it would be a lot easier to fit in there, but it just kind of goes in like that. And if you saw that piece I had before, it's drilled and tapped for these 3 screws. I have to get lined up properly or they're not going to go in. We'll just get them all started first of all, and tighten them up better. So that gives us a pretty good work surface to work on in that, using that thing as a vertical saw. I've got some clamps in place there that'll become clear why they're there a little further, but we've got to turn several of, for instance, we've got to cut that notch. If you see on the top of that, I've got several pieces here that have everything but that notch. And we'll start with how we do that. There's a lot of ways you could go about that. But what I've elected to do is build myself a sled to cut those. So my wood clamp here becomes a stop to help me locate where I want my cut to be. And I'm just going to move that up there and turn the saw on, hold it in place, and make the first half of my V. These 4x6 saws are slow. Some of that tubing I used out there was as thick as a 1/4-inch wall 4x4, and some of that took about 25 minutes per cut to make. This is going to be a lot faster than that, but still it takes a while to make these cuts. So that cuts till the stop hits, and then that controls you so you don't go any deeper than 1/2 inch. Obviously you can't do this horizontally, because if you tried to, you'd cut all the way through. You could use a horizontal saw to make a point on this. You can't use it to make a notch on this, or at least in any convenient way. So you have to kind of switch to some sort of vertical method. And this is just what I came up with. Other people can do this a lot of different ways. If I had to make 1 or 2 of these, I certainly wouldn't have gone all this trouble to build this sled, but since I had to make 15 of them, you start thinking about what can I spend an hour or so doing that's going to save me a few hours down the road, or make these look a lot nicer and be a lot closer to whatever the spec is. These all need to match. A lot of my designs, I try to make stuff organic, so nothing has to match anything else, but that really wasn't possible here. So if you can imagine, I've had to do this several times on both the long pieces and the short pieces to make this up, and I won't go through tons of that, but that's the notch and how it ends up looking. I'm here to show you my welding process here. I kind of tied in some ideas to make these all the same. So I just took this scrap piece of steel here. It looks a little rough, but built this jig to hold these pieces in place as they're being welded. You'll notice on these I've knocked the mill scale off. It's important if you want a good weld. It'll keep that MIG welder from popping and cracking. This is a little spring-loaded plate here. I didn't have that spring on there, but if you don't have that spring, that when you go to take this piece out, that square clamp falls down in the middle of that. It's tough for my big fat fingers to get it out of there, so I put that spring in there just to keep popping it back up where it goes. So we locked that piece into place, pretty clear. I've also knocked the mill scale off the ends of that. I've built these little rocker clamps just out of some of the same 2-inch tubing I'm using to make my decorative element on the balusters. And this is one of the long pieces with the notch already cut. Also knocked most of the mill scale off that. So what the jig is for, obviously you have to hold everything in a line, but you also don't want this stuff to start flexing on you as you weld it and end up with a piece that's bowed this way. So that kind of holds everything down. I've got fairly tight connections here. That clamp wasn't exactly tight. Let's get it tightened up here. All right, that looks like a pretty good gap to weld there. So I'll turn on my gas here. This is a welder I actually bought for this project. So I needed something to weld some heavier steel, so it's a Lincoln Pro 10. My camera person's gonna have to close their eyes when I make this weld. So I'll give you guys a heads up. Okay, I'm gonna start the weld now. No, I'm not. Let's see, what have I done? Stop that. Okay, we had a little bit of an edit there. When I went to weld this, this switch wasn't working. I pulled on the switch on the torch there and it didn't weld at all, so I've had to take that apart and work on the contacts a little bit and got it working. So ready to try this weld here in the jig now. Also equipped my camera person with some welding glasses, so this should be safer anyway. So just welded the front side of that, and the way I built this jig, I've actually got some windows here on the back side where I can at least get this tacked so that when I take it out of the jig it won't bow on me. That's what we were talking about before. And that should be good enough for that step. Take that off. I'm trying to show you how that comes out of there. I slotted these clamps so I don't have to take them all the way apart. And hold these. Gotta take that loose too, or it ain't gonna follow. And then it just comes right out like that. So that's kind of in its original form. It's fully welded on this side. The back side is only partially welded, and I'll just put that in a vise and finish that up before I set it aside. And then I've been dressing those welds down a little bit with a grinder. And then they just have to, I just have to set it back in the bandsaw, cut these angles on the sides that go on the stairs, and it's good to go. So that's how I did it. And hopefully that's helpful, just the concepts there. If you decide to make several of something like this, a jig, and you set up for your bandsaw, give some thought to that before you start. It'll make your life a lot easier.